This happened in 2010. I was 10 years old. I was with some friends on a Friday night. Let's call them Cynthia and Megan. Cynthia was 11 and Megan was 10, like me. We all lived on the same street on a little road called Pineview Drive in Kingston Springs, Tennessee. Our houses were all situated in a sort of triangle, all on the edge of a slope that descended into the huge forest behind our houses. At the time, Cynthia had 2 dogs in her house, and Megan and I had no pets. This will be important later. This happened on a Friday at the end of October. We met up at Cynthia's house to have a sleepover. It must have been around 3 in the afternoon. We arrived early to have as much time together as possible. So we were at Cynthia's house, and around an hour later the subject of the woods behind our house came up. I don't remember the conversation exactly, it was so long ago. But I do remember that we really wanted to find a ghost, because it was rumored those woods were haunted. We all agreed to go out, but first we found a flashlight for each of us. I immediately claimed the big heavy-duty flashlight, one of the big square ones that has a large battery. Obviously, I was that friend who was easily scared and looked over my shoulder whenever I was alone. Because of that, I was reluctant to go, but they convinced me to come along. By now it was getting dark, and we brought out our flashlights. We headed down the hill into the forest, and immediately felt something wrong. Very wrong. The forest had suddenly gone quiet, like all the animals and insects had suddenly fallen silent. Normally there was a whole mess of noises like crickets and songbirds. And like I said, it was early October, so they should have still been out, making their calls and typical animal noises. But instead, it was just dead quiet. But as creepy and foreboding as the silence was, we still went into those damned woods. I guess we were just curious, as kids normally are. But still, it was unsettling to say the least. We walked about 20 yards into the forest, and the trees started to get close together, making it hard to see through them, even with the flashlights. Still, I kept shining my light around, praying to God nothing would pop out at me, and my child's imagination was running wild with things that could kill me. So when I began to hear something that sounded like footsteps behind us, my fear turned into panic. I stopped, and I grabbed Megan by the shoulder, quietly telling her and Cynthia to just stop. We stood there listening, and the sound stopped as well. I know it sounds cliché when I describe it, but I know I heard another pair of footsteps that were definitely not ours. I asked Cynthia if she had let her dogs out before we left, thinking that maybe those sounds were her dogs running around in the woods with us, but she said that they were still inside, and her parents could not have let them out, because they were not home from work yet. Besides, the footsteps sounded heavy like a person. It was certainly creepy, but we didn't give it much thought. We continued to walk, just trying to ignore it. But the moment we took our first few steps, the sound came again. And now I knew. It was not my imagination. I had in fact heard footsteps. I begged Megan to let us head back to the house, but she was not as easily scared as I was. She raised her flashlight and shone the light around us, searching for the source of this sound. I looked with her, and we saw no one. She then called out to it. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no answer. Megan just shook her head, and we continued to walk further into those woods, and I bet you already guessed that those footsteps started up again. I held up my flashlight instantly and looked in the direction I thought the sounds were coming from. There still was nothing there. I decided to try my best to ignore those sounds. We walked for about 5 minutes, I'd say, before Cynthia stopped, her flashlight pointed at something in front of us. Her face was pale, like she had just seen a ghost. At first, I wasn't sure why she was so spooked, and then I turned to look at what her flashlight was pointing at, and I felt my whole body seize up with horror, like I was suddenly unable to move. There was a doll, sitting upright on a stump in the middle of the path, sitting like someone had deliberately put it there, like someone was expecting us. I started freaking out, and had even begun to cry, when all of a sudden there was this giggle, like the sound a little kid makes when they're hiding and they make a little laugh. It was a girl's laugh, and it came from the direction where the doll was sitting. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Now I was really freaked out. I wanted to get out of those woods and get home, At this point, there was nothing my friends could say to convince me otherwise. I started in the direction of the house, and my two friends did not protest. We all headed back in silence, not saying a single word. When we made it to about 10 yards to the edge of the forest, suddenly a horrifyingly blood-curdling female scream erupts from behind us, way out in the woods, like someone had just been stabbed. And that's when we all straight bolted up the hill to Cynthia's house. Her parents still weren't home from work, so we just ran inside and locked all the doors, sitting there in silence. Not one of us spoke up, and we decided not to speak of it, since it was clear no one would believe us. I moved out of there 1 year after the incident, and to this day none of us talk about our weird and creepy experience in those woods. It's been 6 years now, and oddly nothing has happened since. But I still have nightmares about that awful scream from the forest, and I hope like hell whatever that thing was did not follow me. Whether it was a ghost or something else, I'll probably never know, and I don't think I want to. I am a 32-year-old man, yet it is broad daylight as I write this, because what I'm about to share haunts me to this day, to the point that merely thinking about it, or in this case typing this memory, is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only told this story to a handful of people over the last 10 years, because of how terrifying an experience it was for me, but I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Maybe others have had a similar experience. To tell this story and to give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter this post is about. Buckle up, this will be a long one, but definitely not boring. My name is Joshua, but I will change the names to protect the privacy of the others involved in this story. I live in Arkansas, and in the late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, we'll call him Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 at night. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150, and Bob was in his 1980-something white Celebrity. It was really a piece of crap vehicle. Anywho, it was late dusk, becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car. He took us around the area, first to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2-hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted. Again, it was a bust. Then we went to an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted as well. Once again, yawn. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were getting pretty bored. I spoke up to Bob saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." And that's when Bob smiled, saying he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees and daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in that picture. To which I replied, "No." He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there are no power lines either. About this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles down an old dirt road with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing else to light the night except the full moon above us and the clear, starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did as he asked. He walked us to the side of the car where the fence, field, and wooded hillside were. He looked at his cell phone, which his phone and mine had no signal. This was 2003 and this area had no cell towers. But he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 and told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even at complete dark, I could tell this was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small light flickers on in the middle of the hillside. A chill runs down my spine as the 4 of us watched this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, beginning to move, sway back and forth. We sat down and watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes, when I finally spoke up and asked, what the story behind this was. Bob replied that he did not know, but locals had told him that at midnight, every night, this lantern will light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up, and that's when it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who did not think anything could scare me or hurt me. So since we were there with no houses around, I yelled out to it, "We see you. Wow, you're so scary with your little lantern." Then Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife suddenly screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughing stopped as I looked to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth. It was now moving down the hillside to the field at an unhuman pace. Gliding, it began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was, because within seconds we were in the car and flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was quiet. That was until Bob spoke up saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed." If we decided to go back out anywhere, it'd be best to take my truck until he could get gas in the morning. At that point, he only had about an eighth of a tank. I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if we could take my truck to the next town to get some food, because his car would not have enough gas to get us to that town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key, and nothing happened. My truck was dead. Deader than dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. For all intents and purposes, you would think the alternator was out. This was very strange, and after the night we had, it made us all feel uneasy. We stepped out of the truck and popped the hood. We pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump my truck with his car. And this is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connect the jumper cables to his battery and to mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second, the cables in between the connectors start to smoke. And in a flash of fire, they burn up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the end clamps still on the batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car, and we take the clamps off the batteries. We look at each other in this eerie moonlight. Now, there are not any light poles around either, and we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time, as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It sounded like a boat motor. Now, like I said, this was the time of year it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up, as it was, and we were standing still on land at night, but somebody was out on a boat after midnight, when it had to be chilly as all get out with the wind hitting them, and from the sound of this motor was getting pretty fast, but we didn't see anything. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away and a very bright spotlight comes on, momentarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get into his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck, and I give Bob a tire tool. I grabbed one for myself. I did work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We are standing in front of the vehicles in the middle. The hoods were up on both as the boat pulls up to the dock, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s and 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us, and it covered the man in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and I. They looked at us and at our vehicles, and one glances in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us. He lets out a small chuckle. "You fellers got some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the still smoking ashes of what was the jumper cables. "Looks like it was more than your pussy jumper cables can handle. Y'all sure you don't need some help? We got some tools on the boat that I think can fix you guys' problem right up." Then the other man who had chuckled in the beginning says, "Fix 'em right up." I am speechless at this moment, probably with my mouth hanging open. I can't remember as the two men walk back to their boat, and we hear what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they're doing, but the spotlight is so blinding we can't see. but those chain noises were enough. Bob looked at me, and without saying a word, we both jumped in his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours, we drove to a populated area of houses, which really wasn't much in this rural area. We were pretty much stuck in this place since we had very little fuel. Yet we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking at any time those men could find us. Bob would turn his lights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how freaking weird this whole ordeal was, and he laughs at me, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know it'd be this sort of scary." At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out. But the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes until sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see the lantern, to see if it really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said yeah, the local store opens up in about an hour, so we should be fine. I tell him in that case, yeah. We wake up the women and drive back to the hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left until sunrise. We still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks over to me and I smile. I do the motion for zipping my lips, and we all watch in wonder, as right at sunrise, the lantern slowly fades away to nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling a bit safer now. When we get there, there's no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up. Doors are all locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in this area to others. And swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into those boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places. He asked me if I would be willing to film their sessions in the haunted places. It was for their records, and they would pay me well for the service. I am no Wiccan, but I have always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugarloaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown. So I told him yes, I would love to film for them, but I had no interest in joining in. I was just okay with watching and just getting to be out there looking into the paranormal once more. So of course my next question was, when and where are we going to do this first? When he answered me, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut, and told him I had changed my mind. "You remember that lantern light out near Sugarloaf?" He asked me as if there was any way I could ever forget. Yeah, I stammered. "Why do you ask?" I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there, to see if we can contact that spirit and find out why it's there and what it wants, Bob replied. "I don't know, man," I said. "Oh, come on, Josh, trust me, you'll be safe. I'm going to pay you $250 just to sit there and film it," he retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight because diapers, formula, and the like cost a fortune. Not to mention was mine and my new wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities but also buying only the top-of-the-line baby products, like toys, a crib, a playpen, baby monitors, a stroller, car seat, a combination pack and play-changing table, a diaper genie, and designer baby clothes. So because my wife was putting us into the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area he wanted to go back to, with how important it was I make all the extra money I could. So against my better judgment, I accepted the offer. And a week later, I was in the same beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before. This time with Bob, 2 guys and a girl that were complete strangers to me. They each dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces or something of the sort. It was 11:50 when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle. I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence line. I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. Again, as I have been typing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part haunts my dreams and even my waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best for you to describe how the following events unfolded. though I know mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued or how horribly horrific the events sounded and were. So when reading or listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up and believe me when I say, up to this point in my life, I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting, or getting myself spooked or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away from it as possible. And as much as I dread it, I will now finish telling this story. As his group is chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything, it looks like a newer hardcover. Anyway, he starts reciting words from it. Then he looks at his phone and tells his group to be quiet and to look at the hill. I turn the camera and at midnight on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool did not seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with this spirit. I hesitantly turn my back to the light, and I continue to film the group as they began again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. Then they start asking questions and hope that the spirit will respond. About this time a wind picks up, and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me, "Cut the camera for a minute." I oblige and stop recording, and I watch as Bob tries his lighter, and 2 lighters from the group, but none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground, and I spun around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with the candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around I am blinded by the brightest light I've ever seen. What I believe was the lantern up close and personal. But as quick as it appears, the light is gone, and the lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it really was the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me with me not realizing it within the span of maybe 30 seconds. The thing was fast. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside, and there was nothing there. It's only 12:15 or so, and the light has always stayed until sunrise. At this moment the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick, and I see it light up. And I mutter to the group, "Guys, did you just see that?" They all turn around and ask what I'm talking about. But before I can answer them, we are all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter. It's coming from seemingly nowhere and everywhere around us, but distant at the same time, like far off. This is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of children. It haunts me this very moment. As I type this, I'm looking around the room I'm in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. And I can't help but think about how if you add the word S at the beginning of laughter, it spells slaughter. The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine listening to a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start and seconds later another will join in, starting at the beginning of the song and so on and so forth. Well, this sounded like I said hundreds or thousands of children laughing, as if one would start laughing and seconds later another would. And that pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row, row your boat." I'm saying they laughed in unison in a round, just like kids do when singing that song. It kept going and going, and the laughter was only getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling all around us, coming in all directions. I was so scared that I was shaking. I couldn't run. I was spinning around and around, looking off into the distance. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing does not happen in real life. What the hell was happening? Then I scream at Bob and the group that we need to get the hell out of there. But they are already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candle behind. Without hesitation, I run after them, and I jump in the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul out of there and drive about a mile up the road, and we pull over, as Bob is in no condition now to drive. We are all just freaking out. We all get out, pacing around the car, asking each other if we really just heard what we just heard. I tell Bob that I'm sorry, I left his camera behind. He says he doesn't care, and that he's not going back for it. At this point I got my hands on my knees, panting, trying to catch my breath. as I have never been in my life so terrified. And that's when all of our chatter stops, as we once again hear the laughter off in the distance. Very quietly at first, but slowly and surely getting closer and louder, until once again, it becomes deafening. We jump back in the car and speed away. We drive about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles we can still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little. We all start to calm down by mile 4, when the laughter can no longer be heard. But we have no intention of pulling over again, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, desperately waiting for a signal to pop up. And at about mile 6, Bob's friend says, "Hey, I got full bars," and he hands the phone to Bob. Bob calls a friend of his, who is into the occult, and well-versed and educated in it. As we are driving, he is describing what happened. Bob later told me his friend told him she believed it was the children of Hecate or something like that. I have no idea what Hecate has to do with it, but it sounded more like a guess to me. Anyways, as Bob is on the phone speeding out at the area, me and the 2 other people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time, and they told me later that just like me, the hair on the back of their necks stood up, as a loud snapping noise comes from the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stops dead in its tracks, and it won't go forward anymore. He tries everything, but the car is just not moving. We later discovered that a tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking to on the phone only lived about 20 minutes away, and they said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke, and after about 3 minutes, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, so we all unloaded out of the car and stood in front of it, waiting on the vehicle to hopefully stop. The vehicle does not stop, but as it comes into view, it is a beat-up old pickup truck, and it slows down. In the truck, there are 2 men in their 30s or 40s with huge beards. They stare at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob, and before I can speak a word, he says what I'm already thinking. Those were the guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, we see headlights coming from the direction the truck that passed by just went. We went still and quiet as the same guys in the same truck passed by slowly again, staring at us in the side of the road. Bob called his friend back, and he told her to drive like hell and get here now. He hung up, and 4 or 5 minutes go by and we see headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff ready, thinking it's finally Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It's her, the lady who is coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and is going to be about 10 or 15 more minutes before she gets there. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror as I do, as the same truck slowly passes by again. This time there's only one of the boatmen in the truck. Now the driver slows to a crawl, and he says, "Looks like you fellers could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and I that we were definitely dealing with the same boat guys. But where the hell did the other one go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat again? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to the boatmen was immediately reminded to us as we began to hear the laughter again, off in the distance. It was all around us like before, and over the next few minutes it got closer and closer. I'm almost pissing myself as the sound is getting deafening, and we have nowhere to run this time. Then from behind our car off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights come on and 2 vehicles coming towards us, slowly side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road, coming our way. Laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road, and it sounds like it's zeroing in on us, as if hundreds or thousands of children are within reaching distance. There's no wind, no sound, other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road of the 2 vehicles slowly driving towards us, with our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen. We are given a reprieve as at this time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast. We hold our breath. The laughter, the boatmen, what could be next? How will we get out of this? And that is when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up. It's Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car and rolls her windows down, and starts to tell us to get in, when something happens. The 2 sets of headlights ahead, coming from the other direction, turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screams at us to get in, and we do. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner than she starts to drive away, the other two sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they are about a car lengths behind the car we're all crammed in. I yell to her to go, go, go. I tell her she has to go faster, she has to floor it. And for about the next mile, the vehicles stay on us, then they turn off onto a side road. And for the next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter still way off in the distance with our windows down. Then 3 more miles, the laughter was finally gone. To this day, I have no explanation to what happened, what the laughing children were, or why the laughing followed us, if the boatmen were connected to all of this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence that happened to terrify us at the same time as the paranormal stuff. And if that is the case, why do they not react to the laughing children sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it, or even think about it. I have had constant chills and goosebumps as I write this. If there are any typos or grammar issues, it's probably because I'm shaking. I hope someone who hears this has had a similar experience and can share their story as well. In a way, I believe that would help me deal with the trauma this experience still causes me. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills on with, I beg of you, I warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You can think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how powerful or mundane the paranormal can be. If you use the paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. And watch out for seemingly sociopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope everyone hearing this sleeps well tonight, because I know after telling this story, I won't be having any sleep for the next few days. I used to live in a small town called Redditch, found in the UK. Most people think of it as a new industrial town, full of rowdy youths and harsh glares. In a town like that, I understand why people just want to get out of there, like me and my family did. Sadly, not everyone is so lucky. My story took place when I was about 13 years old. Me and my older sister, let's call her Alice for this story, were discussing what to do for Halloween night. Quite often Alice would go to house parties, but she had always wanted to have an outdoor one. So to my dismay, she decided to throw a party in a forest not too far from where we lived. On the evening of Halloween, a lot of people turned up, most of which were my sister's age, 15 and over. They were also her friends. Obviously, I was the butt of jokes because of my age, the fact I was a little chubby at that age and easy to pick on. And my sister didn't seem to care about her younger sibling being bullied. So I decided to take off and head home without telling her. A few minutes into walking to the main road, I felt the need to just kneel down and cry. The feeling was so sudden, it took me by surprise, it made me feel so low. A slight pain came to my throat and around the back of my ears. This feeling made a burning sensation, a suffocating, aching burn. It worsened. Soon I felt my mouth going dry. Then a sickeningly sour fluid filled the back of my throat, making me gag and heave. I trembled on the ground, trying to figure out why I was feeling and acting in this way. Then, just like that, it was gone. Yet I was left feeling hollow and heavy. I pulled myself up to stand, panting and running my hands over my face to rub away the tears, then onto the back of my neck. Once again, when I could finally breathe normally, I took off running, only this time faster. I ran until I could see the main road leading to my house, and I did not look back. I never wanted to see the interior of that forest again, and fortunately I never have. I recently stayed with Helen back in Redditch. I asked discreetly about the party in the woods. She didn't want to discuss that night, especially because she panicked when she realized I had actually left the party alone, not to mention the amount of trouble she had from my parents when they found out. However, after a while, she did tell me about how dumb the idea was to have the party in that particular forest. I didn't know why she felt this way, so I asked. Over the last few years, the forest had become a location for many suicides. especially students. We had been dancing, singing, and messing about right there where young lives were taken. Sadly, I found out that only days before Halloween, a young girl from my sister's school had used her own school tie as a noose in those woods. As my sister told me this, I felt a heavy sadness in my chest. It had occurred to me that I had felt what that girl had felt in her last moments. It hurts so much to think about young lives taken away like that. It hurts even more to think that they felt the need to end it all that way. God, may their souls rest in peace. For those interested, the name of that forest was Pitcher Oak Woods. I've never Googled it myself, nor do I ever want to. There are some things in this life that are best left unseen, or in this case, felt. I know this story doesn't seem terrifying to those who read it or hear it, but to me, that feeling that night, it still affects me deeply. I never go for woodland walks now, and I don't think I ever will again. First off, let me say that I'm an 18-year-old male. I'm currently living in Australia, and I'm a history buff. I have an aunt who's married to a Frenchman who I'll call Pierre. Pierre is a nice guy who's always had a friendly smile and makes my family laugh when he's around. Now, this happened about a year ago when my family was visiting my aunt, somewhere near the Ardennes forest in France. I should say that my aunt lives in a small town near the border of Germany that is heavily forested and filled with a dark history of battles and wars. There is a little stream near our house that has always been my favorite place to go because of its relaxing atmosphere. In this visit, though, there was not much time for Uncle Pierre to take me to the stream because of his new job. It keeps him occupied during much of the day. So one evening, I decided to go alone while everyone was preparing for dinner. I took the regular path that Pierre takes me usually. I found the stream and played a bit with the water. And being curious about World War II, I decided to look for relics around the stream. I know that most people would disagree with me being alone so late, but that thought did not hit me until later. I spent some time looking and decided to head back, seeing that it was already getting pretty dark. Let me remind you though that this is a forest, and it gets really dark, really fast. So it was practically pitch black already. I was stumbling back home, and I could suddenly hear voices coming from all around me. They did not sound English, and needless to say, I began to panic. I've heard all sorts of things about the paranormal, but never really gave it much thought. Anyways, I was practically running back at this point, and my heart was racing, when suddenly everything fell silent, and there was nothing. Not a sound. Suddenly I heard a branch snap behind me, and when I turned to look, I saw them. 3 German soldiers standing a few meters away from me. I was both stunned and horrified. Part of me wanted to believe that they were just reenactors, as reenactments were a pretty common thing around here, but they just looked too real. The helmets they were wearing and all their equipment, it just looked too real. I stood there staring at them for God knows how long. After a few minutes or so, the soldier in the middle began to walk towards me, but I'm not sure walking would be appropriate. He appeared to be gliding along the ground because the twigs and leaves under him did not make any sound as he moved towards me. And that was when I told myself I was getting the hell out of there. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to turn behind me, as I might see them chasing me. I felt my heart skip a beat as I saw the lights of my aunt's house. I ran inside and slammed the door and locked it shut. Everyone inside stood up and looked at me like I was crazy. Then my mom saw the look on my face and asked me what was wrong. I told her everything. She just sighed and hugged me. Then Uncle Pierre told me the story that a large battle was fought here during the last war, known as the Battle of the Bulge, and that ghost sightings around here were not uncommon. Ever since then, I have never went back to that spring at night or late in the evening, in fear that I might see something else again. Needless to say, although I am a fan of history and wars, I hope that what has happened in the past stays in the past. Now, I know this may sound strange, but I swear I saw something out there. I live outside of Yellowstone National Park, so my backyard is basically a wilderness. I was out with my older cousin one day after my high school graduation party, and she was walking me home. It was getting dark out, but I didn't really care. I always loved the forest at night, despite the animals that lived in it. It always calmed me to hear crickets chirping or frogs croaking or the wolves or coyotes howling. However, that day would change my life forever. As we were walking home, we began to hear small things begin to crack, like twigs. We thought it was either a deer or a mountain lion, maybe even a coyote. We kept walking, but we kept our eyes out just in case to keep ourselves safe. Before we reached our house, my cat named Cheetah came running out of the bushes, his fur bristling with fear, and he jumped into my arms. We thought he had encountered something larger than him and he had run to safety, so we just shrugged it off. But I began to think Cheetah was a large and tough cat, and he had faced other larger predators before. He had always been pretty fearless. Now this scared me. I had a feeling that this was no ordinary predator or animal. Within a few minutes, we started to hear low growling, and it didn't sound familiar to any of the animals that lived in the area. It was only barely similar to the big cats in the area, but it was in no way one of them. 8 minutes later, we still hear the growling, and finally we reached the house. My cousin's neck was hurting from constantly looking over her shoulder. After saying goodbye, Cheetah and I walked home. In maybe 10 minutes away from my house, the growling returns. It keeps on until I'm only a few yards away from the house, and I hear the growling get even louder. I turn my head to see what is making that noise. Now this is something I have never seen before. At first I thought it was a large bear, but then I realized it had a very long tail and had huge rounded ears, a lean, narrow, and a large cat-like head and muzzle. It obviously was no bear. Then another thought came into my head, something that I did not even think would come to mind, but it could have been a leopard. This creature resembled a leopard. It had pitch black fur, a common mutation in the spotted big cat world. But there was no way this was a leopard. Not only were we thousands of miles away from the nearest leopard-inhabited continents, and miles away from the nearest zoo, but this cat is probably as big as a car, and it had one thing no other cat or animal in the world possesses: unnaturally glowing, huge, red eyes. After what seemed like 2 minutes, the panther moved closer and I started to walk backwards, slowly keeping enough distance between me and the big cat to make sure that it would not charge. My cat Cheetah was long gone, already standing on the porch. Then this creature let out this very loud, god-awful roar, and I did the stupidest thing you could ever do during a big cat attack. I ran away. This is a terrible idea, because these big cats are much larger and faster than people. And as I was running, I was saying in my head, I must be out of my freaking mind. It only took a few seconds for me to hear those paws hitting the dirt. I was so close to my home when I turned and I saw the big cat charging at me, claws and teeth baring. The thing was roaring and snarling at me as if I was a helpless deer or antelope, and then it jumped towards me. Luckily, I reached the door in time, and me and my cat both ran in and shut the door and locked it. The ravenous creature outside started to claw and bite at the door. It literally felt like the beast wanted me dead. It sounded like it was ripping chunks out of the wooden door. The growling became more intense even though this was a very thick door. I feared it would give in soon. After a painstakingly long moment, the sound stopped. I found myself opening the door. I know it sounds stupid, but there's no window on the door or in the living room, so I had no idea if it was still outside, and I just could not feel safe unless I knew. When I opened the door, I noticed that the thing was gone. There was no trace of it, no sound. I thought it was my imagination, but after seeing the damage on my door, I realized that this was no hallucination or pretend. The next day I went out cautiously, and I looked around the woods where I had been. I found paw prints of the thing on the ground, unusually large paw prints. After this experience, I definitely have a change of heart about walking through the woods so leisurely. Because you never really do know what creatures could be lurking out there, and what animals already see you as their next meal.